Fantastic. Welcome everyone. My name's John Yates. I'm the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund. Absolutely fantastic to have you joining us at this session linked to violence caused by radicalisation. For those who don't know, the Youth Endowment Fund, we exist to get clear what works to prevent violence, and then to build a movement to put that knowledge into practice. But one of the areas we have been thinking about hard recently is the area of radicalisation. And I'm sure many of us who are based here in the UK will have reflected on the recent riots this summer and seen the impact in that case of racist views, Islamophobic views, mixed with concerns about migration, leading to violence in different parts of our towns and cities. One of the things that struck me in that after the riots was there was a really fascinating piece of research that was, in one level, very reassuring. It found that only 7% of the British population supported the violence. So the vast majority didn't. But what was interesting was that within that 7%, most people thought that everyone else agreed with them. And so what you saw just a little sign of was a small group of the population who had become, to some extent, and I use the word slightly cautiously here, but to some extent radicalized. They'd come to believe that their view was the majority view, even though it wasn't. And so I was keen to try and find someone who could help us think more and more deeply about issues around radicalisation. And I'm absolutely delighted that Professor McCauley has been prepared to join us. Professor McCauley has written a number of books. Clark's written a number of books, and so I'll leave him to tell me whether this is the right one to be recommending. But his book Friction, I have found an absolutely fantastic book on how radicalisation. It's called How Radicalisation Happens to Them and Us, and it is well thumbed by me. So just to introduce Professor McCauley, to introduce Clark. He's a social psychologist. He's a research professor of psychology and co-director of the Solomon Asch Centre for the Study of Ethno-Political Conflict at Bryn Mawr College. His research interests include all sorts of things that we're interested in, so stereotypes, group dynamics, the psychological foundations of ethnic conflict, terrorism, and genocide. So some pretty seriously important things for us all. He's the co-author of a whole suite of books, including the book I mentioned, but also Why Not Kill Them All? The Logic and Prevention of Mass Political Murder, The Marvel of Martyrdom, Radicalisation to Terrorism, What Everyone Needs to Know. He's also the founding editor emeritus of the journal Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflict, Pathways Towards Terrorism and Genocide. I'm going to hand over in a second to Clark to share with us some of his more recent research and thinking, and then open it up for some questions. So if you have questions you'd like to ask, do have them ready, and I'll come to you in the second half today. The only other thing I was going to say is we can't really talk about radicalisation without talking about identity. So by its nature, the conversations we're going to have today are really personal, really sensitive topics, whether that's talking about a person being white and how that can become white nationalism, or how a person of faith could become an extremist, or how someone could love animals could become an animal liberation extremist. And so obviously, as we talk that through, we're not for a second saying that everyone who loves animals becomes a terrorist, or everyone who's a person of faith becomes an extremist, or everyone who is white is a nationalist. But we have to talk about the link between identity and violence. And so if you love animals, if you happen to be a person of faith, if you happen to be white, don't be offended. But we have to wrestle with these things very honestly, as I'm sure you would entirely understand. Thank you so much, Clark, for making the time. I hugely appreciate it. Let me hand over to you and shut up for a bit.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely perfectly.
Okay. Well, I'm very pleased to be with you today, folks, and Contra Mark Sageman, I feel like I've learned quite a lot over 20 plus years since 9/11, and I'm very glad to have a chance to share some of my thoughts. And I got to take us on a kind of an intellectual history, I think, to show you how I got to where I'm ending up on the issue of what to do about radicalization, and in particular, radicalization to political violence. So let me go back to 9/11. I remember numerous meetings in Washington, D.C., government and security people eager to get to what they called at the time getting to the left of the boom. That is to say, they wanted to see how the trajectory worked that would bring individuals and groups to political violence and terrorism in particular. And out of that motivation came this concept of radicalization, which refers to the trajectory by which individuals and groups and mass publics move to increased support for one side of an intergroup conflict. Notice I didn't even mention terrorism in there. That is, terrorism is the far extreme, you might say, of a trajectory of increased support for one side of a political conflict, an intergroup conflict. So the trouble with this understanding of radicalization, which maybe not word for word, but in general, I think the way I just described the idea of radicalization and its origins, I believe that'd be familiar to most terrorism scholars. The problem with this kind of formulation is this phrase, increased support. So that problem arises because it can mean one or both of two things. It can mean increased support in opinion or increased support in action. And so one of the things that Sophia Moskaleko, my colleague, and I have got to is that these are quite different problems. And before I go any further with that, I'll just say kind of parenthetically, the more recent enthusiasms for talking about political extremism, countering political extremism, countering, what is it, CVE, countering violent extremism. This formulation has exactly the same problem. Because extremism can mean extreme ideas or can mean extreme action. And these are the two aspects of radicalization that Sophia and I think we have to carefully distinguish. And why is that? Well, because we know from polls that there are hundreds and maybe thousands of people with extreme ideas, radical ideas, who never turned to any political action at all, let alone violent political action. And the second part of the problem is we know from case histories that there are lots of individuals who join a militant group, get as far as terrorist action, who do not join out of any political knowledge, sentiment, ideology, narrative at all. They join because their friends ask them to, because they're looking for status and power, because they're escaping difficult life circumstances of some kind, like the police are already after them for something. So these are individual motives, not really political motives. And we find lots of cases where an individual joins a militant group or joins in a violent group for comrades or status or for love of the people who are already in it. Lots of reasons, individual reasons. So given this disconnect, this double disconnect, there are 100 times at least more people with radical extreme ideas than there are people who turn to any kind of political action, let alone violence. And lots of people get to political violence, at least initially, for personal and individual reasons that have nothing to do with politics. Which, of course, it's true that after an individual joins a militant group, they're very likely to learn a storyline about some kind of political victimization and outrage. And that kind of learning may help keep them in the group after they're there, but they're not the reason they were there in the first place. So this double disconnect is the reason Sophia and I believe that you need to have a careful distinction between radicalization of opinion and radicalization of action. So now I'm ready for the first slide after this peroration. So here's our idea of what radicalization of opinion looks like. There's some people neutral, no opinions about a political division or conflict. There's some people who sympathize with one side of a particular political conflict, intergroup conflict. There's some people who justify violence in this conflict. And then at the very peak of this pyramid, there's the very few who feel a personal moral obligation to take up violence in defense of the cause, in defense of the group that they care about. Notice now I'm alluding to identity, as we were just hearing about a minute ago. So this is not a stage theory. We know cases where individuals go up and down this pyramid skipping steps. So it's not, this pyramid is not a view that you have to go through each of these stages in order. It's not a stage theory. The next slide. So here's the radicalization of action pyramid. Some people doing nothing for a cause or a group involved in intergroup conflict. There's people who do legal things in support of their group in this intergroup conflict. There's radicals who are ready to do illegal things. And at the very peak of the pyramid, there are terrorists, the people who are ready to kill, especially ready to kill civilians in defense of this group that they care about in an intergroup conflict. This also is not a stage theory. This also has cases where individuals skip up and down layers in this pyramid. Okay, next slide, please. So more recently than the pyramids, I've been forwarding an idea that seems to me to make sense, which is that the way to think about the radicalization of ideas, radicalization of opinion, the way to think about that is in terms of a category system that comes out of social movement theory, which is part of sociology. And in particular, a guy named Wilson back in 1973 offered this triple distinction about the ideas that the frames, as he called them, that can support a social movement. First is a diagnostic dimension. Identifies a problem or injustice and who or what is to blame, which in social psychology, we'd be more likely to talk about this as a grievance. Then there's a prognostic dimension. Identifies a proposed solution to the problem. What must be done to make things right? And thirdly, there's a motivational dimension that identifies who should feel responsible to act, including rewards for action, grand vision of the world to be brought by successful action. So out of social movement theory comes this three-way framing of the ideas required to have a social movement get somewhere. Well, let's have the next slide. I'm going to kind of skip along through these next couple slides because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. What I just offered you as a three-dimensional conception of the ideas behind social movement, and I'm claiming behind radicalization. This is pretty rare in the literature. My guess is many of you have never heard of this product of social movement theory. But I bet what you have heard of is ideology and narrative. The reason I think this is if you just Google ideology and terrorism, you get umpteen million hits. If you Google narrative and terrorism, you get somewhat fewer million hits. And if you Google diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational action frames and terrorism, you get many fewer. So it's not just my experience at meetings that makes me think that ideology and narrative are dominant conceptions for thinking about the war of ideas. So the trouble is here, there are umpteen definitions of ideology, and they don't agree. And Ackerman and Burnham, back in 2019, did this absolutely heroic job, found in the literature 46 different definitions of ideology, but they developed their own, and here it is in quotes. An ideology that enunciates specific grievances, delimits enemies, legitimates violence against those enemies. I'd note for you that we're talking about enunciating grievances, that's a diagnostic frame. Delimiting enemies, that's the perpetrators of the injustice, that's diagnostic frame. Legitimates violence, that's a prognostic frame, what to do. So out of all of this effort to look at definitions of ideology, we come out with something that looks pretty much like diagnostic and prognostic frames to me. Next slide. So here's Holbrook and Horgan, their definition of ideology. Actually, they offer two in the same article. One is the one up top and one is the one in the bottom, where they go so far as to say ideologies provide a shared sense of belonging, stories, community, heritage. And their example is a nasheed, which is a kind of a chanting song, I guess you could say, that is popular in jihadist cultures. Anyway, Holbrook and Horgan's effort seems to me shows again the difficulty of defining ideology. And by the way, who measures ideology? I mean, who actually goes out with an operational definition and starts trying to measure ideology? especially given that lots of people are ready to say that ideology is something that changes with political circumstances and conditions. So you'd think we'd have to be eager to try to measure those changes, but I don't know of any efforts, serious efforts to measure something as big as ideology. Next slide. So here's the problems. Definitions are not agreed. When they get to talking about ideology, it often sounds like collective action frames and no measurement. Next slide. Then there's narratives. Another popular way of conceptualizing the war of ideas in terms of narratives, competing narratives. So here's the most serious effort that I know of by people who actually study narratives for a living. Halverson, Corman, and Goodall. I'm going to leave you to read this quote in the next paragraph. Extremists see the world, ... Well, when you get to the end of that, I hope you can see that in this quotation, or to put it another way, that this quotation can be easily translated into diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational frames. The motivation is Muslims coming forward as champions. That's an invitation to heroism. So let's see the next slide. Here's a couple more effort. Well, one more, Braddock and Horgan and Braddock. And this time the issue was about Animal Liberation Front. They identified 3 themes at the end of going through narratives, initial theme codes, consolidated codes, 10 overarching themes. They end up with the 3 most prevalent themes: near human cognitive capacity of animals, animal kind-heartedness, and victimization of animals. So this is a diagnostic frame. It basically says animals are cognitively pretty much like us, and emotionally or affectively pretty much like us, and yet we do terrible things to animals. So it's a diagnostic frame, it's a grievance. Next slide, please. So it's the same kind of limitations that we saw with ideology. The definitions aren't agreed. 2 attempts to measure extremist narratives, the 2 prominent ones that I've mentioned here, reduce the narrative to themes. There's no talk about events, characters, action over time, which are the elements that most people talk about when they talk about a narrative. And the themes that they come up with at the end of studying narratives sound very much like collective action frames. Next slide, please. So just to show you how you could be measuring diagnostic framing, I guess I want to say more generally, I think that diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational framing is a lot easier to understand, to define, and to measure than narrative and ideology. So here's an example. You think US-led war on terrorism is a sincere effort to reduce international terrorism. 40% of the Pew poll didn't believe that, indicating belief in a war on Islam. And here's a START poll from 2017. More directly, do you think the war on terrorism is a war on Islam? 40% say yes. So this is a question. These are questions that I think are pretty explicitly measures of diagnostic framing. Next. Then there's, in the Pew poll, there's another question, which I think is pretty bold. Some people think suicide bombing and other forms of violence against civilian targets are justified in order to defend Islam from its enemies. Other people believe that no matter what the reasons, this kind of violence is never justified. You personally believe it's often justified, sometimes, rarely, or never. About 8% of US Muslims thought this kind of violence is often or sometimes justified. So I think this is a measure of prognostic framing, what to do. I think this is a measure in the opinion pyramid. This is a measure of justifying violence. On the previous slide, perceptions of a war on Islam, that's a perception of grievance or diagnostic frame. Okay, next slide. And here's a possible measure. My knowledge has never been used. How many Muslims do you think admire the individuals who join the jihad against those who attack Islam? And I see this as a measure of motivational framing, because the more people an individual sees as admiring violent action, the more the individual is motivated to undertake violent action, to turn from zero to hero, as some have described it. So I want to claim to you that polling measures of diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational frames can track the war of ideas in a way that loose talk about ideology and narrative cannot. Next slide. Then I had an awakening one time, something I'd read long ago but hadn't really understood the importance of it. It's a book by Munson, 2008, The Making of Pro-Life Activists. And what he makes quite a lot of in there, which really struck me and kind of belatedly, is that there are 4 different streams of pro-life activists. They all agree about the grievance or the diagnostic frame. They all agree that abortion is wrong and terrible, that it's murder. But there are 4 different kinds of prognostic frame in action in the anti-abortion movement. One is political. Groups focus on legislation, litigation, lobbying, education, advertising, websites, TV, radio, billboards. Service groups offering counseling, social services to women with unplanned pregnancies. And then there's the 4th is direct action, the kind we usually think of as the anti-abortion action. But all 4 of these are action. It's just only one of them is violent action. And what struck me, I admit years after I read this, what struck me was the importance of noticing that they have the same, these 4 streams, they have the same diagnostic frame, but they got 4 different competing prognostic frames. And they are competing, especially in the sense that only a very small percentage of people in the pro-life movement that Munson studied, only a very small percentage ever participated in more than one stream. So you don't join a movement, you join a stream. So that made me think, well, is it true more generally? If we look at radicalization to political violence, in the jihadist realm or the far right realm, can we find these 4 streams, these 4 competing prognostic frames? Next slide. Well, I think I found them. I think I see them in the Islamist movement. There's the politics stream, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Muslim Brotherhood. There's the education stream, various Dewa organizations, Wahhabi support for mosques and such. Service, social service activities of Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood. And there's a really neat article by Ken Reedy about British Muslims volunteering their time and money and effort to truck medical and food supplies to Syria. That's a service stream. And then there's the direct action stream. There's Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the ones that they inspire, and these are the people we're usually worried about. But notice that these people all share the same frame. Muslims are victims, the West are perpetrators, and there are 4 competing prognostic frames about how to respond to this victimization. Next slide. And then I'll take a look at the US far right movement. So we've got the political stream, Trump and MAGA supporters. We got the education stream, Fox News, Glenn Beck, John Stossel. Got the service stream. I found there's 100 plus crowdfunding sites for individuals indicted for the January 6th Capitol breach. And then there's the direct action stream, which is the one we usually hear about and worry about, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, various militias. So I'm saying, after I had this idea about the importance of competing prognostic frames within the same diagnostic frame, I think I can see it at work, these four streams, in both the far right and the Islamist movements. Next slide. So, why is it so important to recognize that there are these four streams? Well, because it suggests that we could be contesting the prognostic frame rather than the grievance. We could be contesting in our CVE efforts, or PCVE efforts, we could be contesting violence as the best answer to the victimization, the grievance, the diagnostic frame that we're obsessed with. And why would that be a good idea, to contest the prognostic frame instead of the grievance? Well, because we've been doing something pretty dumb, I think. We've been trying to contest the grievance. It's very difficult to persuade Muslims the West is not killing Muslims in Muslim countries. I mean, it's on the news. It's not just on far-out websites. It's difficult to persuade right-wing extremists the Great Replacement is not happening. The government is not welcoming minority immigrants, because they are. But we could contest the prognostic frame. We could contest the idea that violence is helpful. It's going to help Muslims who are victims or whites who are victims. We could concentrate on the prognostic frame and stop trying to make believe that we can contradict the diagnostic frame. Next slide. So here's the big picture. There's big limitations, conceptual and empirical, for ideology and narrative. And diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational frames seem to me a much better way to think about the war of ideas and for tracking the war of ideas and our successes and failures in the war of ideas in polls. Polls that'll put numbers on the layers of the opinion pyramid. And the concluding idea, we should focus on the prognostic rather than the diagnostic frames, including encouraging these other three frames, the political, the educational, and the service activism, as better prognostic frames than violence. Thanks for your attention. I'm ready for some discussion.
Fantastic. Clark, thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, there is a colossal amount in all of that for us to get our head around. So thank you. Perhaps I might take chair's prerogative by just asking a couple of questions your way to begin with. And while I'm doing that, do raise your hands, everyone else, and I'll make sure within the time we've got, I bring in as many people as humanly possible. The first question I had is, one of the things that I think happened in the UK as we've wrestled with issues around extremism is at times the government has said what we need to do is challenge and contest more conservative religious views or more extreme far right views. I think if I'm hearing what you're saying, I think you're saying I'm not sure that's going to get you anywhere. What
I'm
you
sure
need
it's
to be
not
doing
going to get you anywhere.
is yeah. So I just want to draw you on that a bit more.
I'm sure it's not going to get us anywhere because we've been doing that. I mean, that's what the whole CVE program is about, isn't it?
And so
We've shifted from focusing on terrorism to focusing on extreme ideas, which certainly made it easier to get grant money, and a lot more people can do the research, and it's a lot easier work than trying to study actual terrorists. So, I mean, I could see there's lots of human reasons why this has seemed like a congenial shift. But, you know, the shift from the problem is political violence to the problem is bad political ideas, this has been a tremendous mistake. It's not working. And not only that, you kind of multiply the target problem by 100 or maybe 1,000, because that's how many people have radical ideas who never do anything.
Yeah. So let me thank you. That's very clear. The second question I was going to ask you is your view is that there always are going to be people who have different views in a society, and some of them may well have views that say things need to radically change. What we need to do is try and avoid people responding to that by saying violence is the answer. Now, the question I had was, what do you think it is that means that people pick the violence option rather than the education option, or rather than the political action option? Do you have a sense of what it is that draws people into that more political response, into that more violent response?
Well, I'd say the simplest interpretation, I can see maybe several, but the simplest interpretation is the reciprocity rule. All around the world and in every culture, you find the tendency to try to return help for help and harm for harm, tit for tat. So, considering that a sizable part of the grievance, at least for the Islamist movement, is violence. It's violence by rulers of Muslim nations, supported by Western power, who do violence to their own people to stay in power. There's the violence of Western military, mostly the US, in Muslim countries. I've forgotten what the most recent total is. How many Muslim countries do we have US military in? US military, not ambassadors. I'm not talking about AID people. I'm talking about people wearing boots and carrying arms. How many? Well, I mean, it's dozens, at least. And you don't have to go to some far out website in order to learn how many Muslims are being killed by Western military in their own countries. And, you know, you can sanitize that, call it collateral damage, as if it doesn't really count, but for Muslims it counts. So the reciprocity rule, which is kind of the easiest or Old Testament idea of justice and fairness, the reciprocity rule says if we're being done violently, then they deserve to get some violence back. So why does violence loom up faster and easier than these other three prognostic frames? I think that's at least one reason.
One of the things you write about in Friction is about someone becoming unfrozen, and I thought this was a really sort of interesting point you made about a journey that someone could take from being actually quite sort of radically convinced to being violent. Do you mind just explaining what that means and what it is, and how it works?
Well, unfreezing means losing everyday social connections and routines. The everyday interactions that keep most of us in our traces.
So I might feel like I've got radical views, but I've got my job, I've got my family. There's quite a high cost socially if I was to act violently.
Yes, but I mean, it's more than that. The idea pyramid also gets some horsepower from out of unfreezing, which in sociology they call it biographical availability. Most of us have had a period or two in our lives where we're unfrozen, like we leave our family and we go off to university. Now we're in a whole new place. We don't know anybody or hardly anybody. And we're trying to make our way in this new environment. And we're open to new people and new ideas in a way that we wouldn't have been if we were still back in high school living with our families. Or we moved to another country for various reasons, which is the kind of the situation of the 9/11 attackers. They all moved off to Europe, basically, where they were strangers in a strange land. And the local mosque was the only touchstone of every day that they had left to them. So I'm just saying, there are various ways in which we can see, maybe in our own lives, periods where we were kind of disconnected, searching, open, looking for new friends, and open to new ideas. And this kind of opening can lead to many kinds of radical change, and it's not necessarily goes in the direction of terrorism. I mean, some people join a cult.
Or get very into running, or going to the gym, or
yes,
whatever their new friends happen to be all doing.
There's a whole subculture of, rock climbers.
Yeah.
So
what struck me in your argument, if I combine what you said today and what you write in Friction, it strikes me that people may well feel sympathy with, say, far-right views, but it may well be that something happens to disrupt their life, or they've never been very moored in their life, and they fall into a group which gives them the diagnosis, which says, actually, be part of us, and part of the answer is violence. And actually that is pulling them. So actually trying to affect the group dynamics may be part of the answer. I wondered if you could play that against a slightly different thought, which is, we know there are children and people who grow up in our countries who have a higher tendency to commit acts of violence completely unrelated to a set of radical beliefs. Often because of trauma that's happened to them, often because of issues around self-control, often because of lack of role models. Are they the same people who, if they become interested in extremist ideas, might become violent? So how much of it is the group, and how much of it is these are just the sort of people that, if they're attracted in, are going to be violent?
You're onto a very interesting line there, which I did not have time or take time today to try to make anything of this line. But the line you're on is that it's a big mistake to talk about terrorists like they're a single category, like at least psychologically, to treat them as a single category. There's all kinds of different roles in a terrorist group, even a small one. So some people are going to be out trying to get intel, and some people are going to be trying to lay hands on weapons, and some people are, anyway, so there's these different roles, and probably different kinds of psychology, personality psychology, associated on the average with these different roles. So, it's a lot of people have noticed that terrorist group leaders seem to be quite different psychologically than the followers. Well, that's just the beginning. That's the tip of the iceberg. The whole iceberg is that there are many different roles in any group, even in a small group, And these roles are inhabited by people who have personality. These roles, people gravitate into these roles in relation to their own proclivities and personalities. And that's something which, I'm right now editing a handbook of terrorism psychology, and I have a chapter coming in about terrorist roles and the importance of distinguishing them, and especially when it comes to issues of de-radicalization, what it takes to move people out of these roles can be quite different depending on the role. So it's important to pay attention to the fact that the terrorists are not like all one psychology, all one personality, all one proclivity. Now, that said, once a group starts turning toward violence, the people who already have experience with violence are going to tend to rise to the top and become leadership, have more to do with the direction of the group. So if you look into the histories of the people who were caught up in the French terrorist attacks and the ones that came out of Belgium, those people, a lot of those people had some previous criminal history, including some minor league violence history.
Yeah.
And so, no doubt that was part of the contribution to their moving toward and then moving up in one of these militant groups.
Yeah, thanks. You do often see that when a more violent person becomes the leader, the group starts to move. And a couple of questions that people have posted. So thank you very much, Dean. Thank you very much, Carly. So first one was, can you just say a bit about the link? Is there a link between, say, we've got the political action? So say we take the far right, we've got the political action raising the grievance. We've got the education potentially promoting the grievance. We've got services support kind of justifying and giving some sort of moral weight to the grievance. Your point is focus on the bit that's violent. I guess one question would be, but don't those first three potentially feed the funnel that includes the people who pick the violent stream? So is there some bit of you that thinks, well, we still need to worry a bit about those first three streams?
Well, again, I've spent a lot of time writing about the mechanisms that move individuals and groups to political activism and political violence. And starting long ago, Sofia Moskalenko and I advanced, I think it's like 5 different individual level mechanisms. There's group grievance, there's personal grievance, there's status and power seeking, there's love for people already in the military. Anyway, so we laid out mechanisms at the individual level, mechanisms, group dynamics kinds of mechanisms at the group level, and mechanisms at the mass level. Now, at the mass level, the 3 we tried to forward are martyrdom, which as an example and a model and a motive, all 3 of those tends to move people toward increased sympathy for the martyr's cause. And not only that, at the individual level, shames people who aren't doing as much as the martyr sacrificed. So we got martyrdom, and we've got basically intergroup conflict, like the big radicalizing influence that 9/11 had on US population. Well, anyway, so part of your question is asking me to talk more about the different levels. And I agree that there's a lot of work to be done there, individual level, group and group dynamics level, the mass level, the pyramid, the opinion pyramid is mostly the mass level. And it's only recently that I've come around to a view of what is the importance of the mass level for the individual and the group level. I think that's one version of the question you were just asking. What difference does it make how many people sympathize with the militant group, or how many people justify the violence of the militant group? And the answer I've come around to only very recently is I think it sets a group norm. The more people who are, and it's not so much a matter of how many are actually in each of those layers, the bottom neutral layer, the sympathizer layer, the justifier layer. It's not so much a matter of how many are actually in those layers, it's how many are perceived to be in those layers. Because the perception of more people in the sympathizer and justifier layers, that perception is the perception of an audience for whom an actor, lone actor, or a small group of militants, they're heroes. It's the perception of the number of people in my own group, our group, us. How many of us sympathize with the militant cause, agree with the militant grievance? How many justify violence, especially that last one? The more people that justify violence, the more social support, the more normative power there is behind that kind of behavior. The more reward, the more social reward and status reward there is perceived.
Yeah.
For somebody who takes up violence.
I think I take your argument to be saying, look, if we can reduce the sort of norm of people having very radical views, often that's quite a good thing. But we shouldn't probably kid ourselves that actually some of the views could be quite benign views in some ways. So believing that animals should be treated fairly and that we shouldn't eat them and that we should look after them, most people say it's a pretty benign view. But I think you're saying even that can metastasize into violence. And so, yes, we should try and contest views, but we also need to fight the violence. Is that a fair?
Yeah, you got to contest the prognostic frame.
Can I throw a slightly different one at you? Like one of the things we worry about a lot, and it's a question that Elias has asked today, is about teenagers or children being groomed. So groomed into getting involved in violence by people who are actively involved in encouraging others. How should we think about that grooming? Because that grooming to begin with probably won't sound like the child's being encouraged to be violent. It probably sound like first of all, it's an encouragement to recognize that there's a problem, and then to say there's a solution, and then to say the answer is violence. So we might miss out the sort of the badness by saying we're not worrying about the frame, we're just worrying about the violence.
Well, I don't know. See, I haven't studied this grooming phenomenon. I think it's a kind of an analogy with homosexual grooming or pederast grooming of what victims they would like to have. And I've never really studied that, so I'm a little reluctant to have a.
You're an honest academic. You're saying what's your area of expertise and what's not.
I will say that there's been a great tendency to see wily terrorist leaders and popularizers and radicalization from above is kind of the generality that I think of it with. That there are these clever people who know how to move ignorant innocence. But when you get into case histories, you don't find very many of those. I'm not saying you never find, but you don't find very many of those. I mean, if you go to look to see who are the people from North Africa who volunteered to go and join ISIS, or even the people from Europe who volunteered to go and join ISIS, were these people who were somehow led astray by some wily propagandist over the internet? Well, I think that's pretty seldom. I think we like to think and talk about that because it gets us out of talking about grievance. See, once you start talking about, I think one of the downsides of the three prognostic frames that I offer to you, one of the downsides of that way of thinking about the war of ideas is that once you start talking about grievance and diagnostic frame, you've admitted that there's a group conflict at the bottom of this. The nice thing about talking narratives and ideologies is it puts the problem out there. It's in their heads. They got these bad ideas. And that's the problem. And as long as the problem's out there and their bad ideas, we don't have to face up to the fact that this is an intergroup conflict and they got a view of some grievances. And of course, that gives us some grievances and the whole thing becomes an intergroup conflict. And with bad luck, it can escalate. And once you start thinking about it as intergroup conflict, you have to pay attention to both sides. But if you talk about bad ideas in their heads, then the problem's out there and it's okay, and we'll send people to find them and fix them and forget them. So it's convenient, this thought about bad ideas and wily propagandists feeding bad ideas into people's heads. That whole way of thinking about the problem, in my opinion, is a way of dodging the intergroup conflict perspective and the mutual grievance view that comes out of that.
Clark, thank you. We're pretty much out of time. I'm so grateful for you joining us, and thank you everyone else, and thank you for the questions that everyone asked. What I've really enjoyed about the book and also about your other writing and today is it makes my brain hurt. Like I have to think, and I feel if you've said anything today, I think you've said don't accept easy answers to what is a very difficult question. In fact, we need to think much more deeply. And you pointed us back. Many of us on the call care a lot about violence reduction outside of extremism, and I think you've underlined the importance of us understanding how we pull people away from violence, including in this space. So I'm going to thank you so much, Clark, for making the time. I'm sure I'm not the only one whose brain is churning, and thank you so much for everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing many of you in future. Thanks so much, Professor. Nice to see everyone. All the best. Bye-bye.